Hey, this is Mr. Aiken with the weekly update for September 23rd. So keeping things short here, just a couple of updates for the class. First of all, double check the gradebook if you have not already. We're pretty much caught up, I believe, on those first three assignments. The next two virtual assignments will be added to the gradebook soon, so make sure we're caught up on those. And I'm pretty sure everything has been straightened out, so email me if you have any problems with that. The other thing is in class, Cohort B started it on Tuesday, and Cohort A will start tomorrow, our first project. So the virtual lesson following it will just be some time to work on that project. So all of those guidelines are on Google Classroom, so make sure you're checking that out as well. Otherwise, just staying up to date on the virtual lessons. Otherwise, let's get into the recap here. We're talking about Justinian and Charlemagne, two leaders in Dark Ages Europe. We're going to start with Justinian, who is the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And the empire that he created was fairly large. So we know that the Byzantines were the eastern half of the empire. That former split was somewhere here around the boot of Italy. But we also know that Justinian, being a strong military leader, did manage to retake a lot of this land back that had been lost after the fall of Rome. So the notes that we took were on this diamond chart here. So we had our four characteristics. We had economic, political, military, and culture/religion. So as far as economic goes, we discussed the fact that he was not very good with money, and that made him not very popular amongst his own people. So he left the empire nearly bankrupt upon his death, mostly throwing most of his money at that military, trying to expand and thus create a map that looks like this, right? This is what he was going for. Cost a lot of money to pay his military to go this far. The video we watched in class also talked about his trickery and ways that he used to get money, such as not paying his soldiers or sometimes forging their wills. So a soldier would die fighting for Justinian, and he would magically have a will that says that this dead soldier is going to give all of his money and belongings to Justinian, which was very fishy, and rightfully so, because most of those were fake. But those were just some of the ways that Justinian got money out of his people in order to fund that military. As far as political, we talked about Justinian's Code, which was a new law system, made it much easier to follow the laws in a nice written code. And then we also talked about the Nika Revolt, being that uprising of his people against him. Obviously, he was not very liked. However, they were able to put down the Nika Revolt by calling in the military, which we'll talk about here in a second. And after the Nika Revolt, he had all of his political rivals murdered in order to maintain his power. We also discussed his wife Theodora, who was his co-ruler. She had just as much power as him, which was kind of a new idea at the time, to have an emperor and his wife kind of share that power. Bottom left here, we're talking military. We showed the map before that he retook lost parts of the Western Empire and was very successful with that. However, we also discussed that after his death, the motivation to keep those lands was relatively low, and the expenses needed to do so were also fairly high. And so they lost almost all of that land after his death. We also put in that category using the military to stop the Nika Revolt. He brought in the military and had thousands of his own people killed who were a part of that revolt. Last, in culture/religion, we talked about the fact that he was a Christian, and after the destruction of Constantinople, essentially, he was able to fund the building of one of its most important buildings called the Hagia Sophia, which really was this massive church, very Roman in its structure, that truly showed the power of the Byzantines. So those were kind of the highlights of the things that we talked about for Justinian. The second leader we talked about was Charlemagne, who is sort of a different story here, and was a ruler in Western Europe. So after the fall of Rome, there were a ton of different tribes, the Saxons, the Moors, the Lombards, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, a whole bunch of different barbarian groups were kind of fighting over all of these areas of Europe, hoping to take kind of chunks out of the former Roman Empire that had existed there. The most successful was going to be Charlemagne and his kingdom of the Franks. So you can see that the lighter green was the areas that he had in 768, and then the darker green areas are those that he conquested over the course of his 40, almost 50-year reign, including the city of Rome, probably the most important takeaway there. So a very important empire that Charlemagne put together. So for economics, we talked about his seeing as necessary to improve education within his empire. So he built schools and churches across Europe with the intent of teaching people both how to read and write, and as well as converting them to Christianity. And we also discussed kind of the lack of trade, just that being a symptom of the way life had changed after Rome was gone. There were no longer these large cities, and so therefore there was a lack of trade both within the empire and outside of it. For political, we showed on the map the increase in size of the empire dramatically, both under him and under the previous Frankish rulers. We also discussed the Pope giving him the title of Holy Roman Emperor, essentially as a thank you for him defending the Holy Lands in Rome from invaders. So that title, very important, and is going to come up again and again here throughout the rest of the semester. We also talked about how he made the empire easier to manage by splitting it up into 350 different sections, each with their own count. This would make it easier for those counts to respond to problems as they came up, so that Charlemagne didn't have to be everywhere at once. For military, we talked about the fact that he went on yearly campaigns and never lost a military fight. So very impressive, especially considering he was a warrior king. So that means that he was often fighting alongside his men. A very strong fighter. It's thus why he was able to protect the Pope from those invaders. And then last in culture/religion, we talked about the fact that he was very Christian, a Christian king who converted people to Christianity by force. It was essentially the death penalty under his rule if you were not a Christian or were found practicing a different religion. And as mentioned in economics, he saw education as very important. He even learned to read and write himself and required all of his own military leaders to read and write. And he hired monks to teach and copy books and to teach literacy. So he wanted the church to be involved in kind of spreading education and spreading the religion throughout his empire. And so that pretty much is what we covered this week. Charlemagne and Justinian are the focus of our project. So make sure you're checking out those guidelines on Google Classroom. We had class time for Cohort B on Tuesday. Cohort A will get some class time tomorrow on Thursday. And we'll continue on. We're getting close to our first test. We'll probably start talking about when that is actually going to be next week. So be on the lookout for that. Otherwise, I hope you have an awesome day.